Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game Battle Report. Today we're playing Haqqislam versus JSA, both vanilla versions of the faction, and the scenario is Hardlock. Now, this list on screen now is the Haqqislam list we're playing today, and it will be familiar to anyone who has recently watched my Haqqislam faction focus, the last video that went up on the channel, but in case you're unfamiliar with it, this was, with only one adjustment, the sample list that I showed at the end of that video. The only change we've made is an adjustment to combat groups. In the sample list in the video, we had a 9-6 split. I'm used to doing that with Haqqislam because of Saladin's Strategist level 2, which allows you to very easily move models between combat groups at the beginning of each round, and the reason why we've made the change is actually because of Saladin's Strategist level 2. What I was finding in playing this list is that very often I would actually want to flick something from group 1 into group 2 in order to use the orders in that combat group, because otherwise that combat group can be a little bit static, as it's home to a 3-person fire team and then effectively 2 cheerleaders. And so very much the plan with this list is that at some point, beginning of each round, we will move one model that needs the orders into Combat Group 2, where it can spend those orders if the Janissary Odalisque team doesn't have anything to do. But from the top, what's in this list? To begin with is a Xebec Aeromobile unit. It's got the AP Spitfire, it can transmute into the operator, one of 2 vehicles Hackislam has access to, and personally my favourite, although they are very close. We then have an Mukhtar MSV2 Red Fury, Zuleika and Zamira, both biker twins. I like both of these models very much. They are unique to vanilla Hackislam, and they consistently perform very well for me. Layla Sharif. Layla is the sole hacker in this list. She's basically present just so I have some kind of hacking presence. And she's fairly good at that. As a Sixth Sense hacker with Carbonite and a killer hacking device, she's usually got something useful to do, and at 22 points, she's relatively affordable. To get some network projection, and then this is a midfield specialist, we then have a Hunsakut Forward Observer. This is the more expensive profile with the deployable repeater, since Layla benefits a lot from that. A Hassassin Fade, Saladin, and then 2 relatively active Ghazi Matawias, one with a boarding shotgun Emirat smoke grenades, one with a boarding shotgun Jammer smoke grenades. Now, for practical purposes, there's a fairly strong argument that one of the 2 of these should probably be a 7 or 8 point combat remote, because one thing this list is missing is deployment zone repeaters apart from Saladin. However, we are playing the Matawia version in this game because I didn't bring my models to the game store to have those remotes present. And as it would happen, both of these Matalia would do something quite useful. Combat Group 2 then consists of a Janissary linked with a pair of Odalisques, one with Disco Ball, one Paramedic, and then 2 cheap Chain Rifle Jammer Matalias. These are just cheap regular orders because of Saladin, and generate Jammer arrows and Chain Rifles, just very, very valuable for 6 points. We could frankly have more of them if we really needed the points. We could trim one of these Matalia down, but 2 Jammers and Chain Rifles is really nice. This is a list built around coordinated orders, lots of active turn pieces, decent defense behind the insulation of the Matawia, and generally, to the maximum extent possible, maximizing all of the tools that vanilla Hackislam has that are kind of unique to it. One thing I wanted to just talk about in discussing this list, though, is something just about list building philosophy that I have, because obviously I put a lot of my lists online, they are frequently featured on the channel, and this list kind of exemplifies something that I tend to do in my list construction. There are some things that are notably absent from this list. There are no dedicated ARO pieces. There is nothing like a Hassassin Nadir or a Total Reaction Remote. Nothing that is truly dedicated defense. Instead, there are models that can perform defensive roles, and the cheap close-in defense is fairly robust, but nothing like a hard ARO piece. Secondly, there is no insurance against Saladin's death. There is no Bashi Bazook, there is no Havsa for Hollow Mask, there is no Havsa for Chain of Command. I am just having to defend Saladin with the pieces that are here. And one of the things that will very often happen when I post a list online is that people will kind of ask, oh, hey, you don't have any ARO pieces, you don't have any defenses like that, you don't have Chain of Command or a Bashi Bazook. Don't you think you should take something like that? What happens if the worst case scenario materializes? And while those absolutely are very reasonable concerns, right? You want to think about how your list handles certain kind of attacks, how you recover from bad situations. Something that is really worth just kind of bearing in mind is, firstly, every troop that you take in a list has an opportunity cost. The barest, cheapest war correspondent, 6-point Matawia in this list, that still occupies some points and a troop slot, and so, to an extent, represents a decision not to take a number of other things. If I wanted to put hard ARO pieces or chain of command, or even a cheap Bashi Bazook, that would still necessitate cutting something from this list. And especially when we start talking about the more expensive insurance policies that you can put in a list, the more expensive defensive pieces, but even stuff like Chain of Command, what I have just found over long experience with Infinity at this point is that no matter what you do, you are going to sustain casualties in your forces while playing this game. And those casualties are going to be weighted towards most of the time your active turn pieces for two reasons. Firstly, those active turn pieces are having orders spent on them in your active turn. They are taking gunfights or performing tasks in your active turn, and that brings with it some risk. Even very good gunfighters are going to occasionally find themselves on the receiving end of bad luck, and even very good scenario elements are going to occasionally have to expose themselves to fire to accomplish an objective. And then, secondly, your active turn pieces, particularly your powerful or important active turn pieces, are very often going to be priorities for your opponents to put down in their active turn. And so, what I find over long experience with Infinity is that far more often, if I find myself in a bad or difficult to recover or losing game state, it's not because I didn't bring an insurance piece to cover off on some specific risk, but because I'm running out of active turn pieces that allow me to progress the game state. I've been locked out of scenario, I've been locked out of the ability to progress through some hard ARO defenses that my opponent has. And so when thinking about how I spend those last few valuable troop slots, how I spend my last 20 or 30 points, almost overwhelmingly, I have found that my overall win rate is improved by skewing towards redundancy in my active turn pieces, in having more pieces that can progress the game state towards an outcome that resolves in my favor, over cutting any of those pieces for hard AROs or dedicated defense, and especially toward insurance policy pieces like Chain of Command, if those Chain of Command really come with any kind of significant opportunity cost. And so I bias toward active turn pieces because active turn pieces are how you win the game. And redundancy in active turn pieces is how you avoid the most common situation in which you can no longer progress the game state towards victory is when you run out of active turn pieces. And that's not to say that I never take Chain of Command. I do take Chain of Command, particularly when I have an active lieutenant that I expect to die. In that case, the insurance policy is sensible because it will matter often. But with Saladin, I am going to defend him with every resource I have access to in this list. I will use ostensibly active turn pieces conservatively as ARO elements. I will use all of these soft ARO defenses to insulate my deployment zone. I'll have multiple models in between Saladin and risks that he might face. And by accepting that there is still some inherent risk, I cannot guarantee Saladin's safety, but I can defend him aggressively. I save myself one or two troop slots and 12 to 30 points that let me bias the list towards more active turn pieces, and that ends up mattering because that affords things like a Zabek or a Mukhtar, or even just the Hassassin for day. Those all get put in, like one of those would have to be cut to accommodate insurance pieces that would give me a safety blanket for Saladin. Instead, I will just try and defend Saladin. And this is something that we'll see in a lot of lists that I play, not all of them, but a lot. And because it's an interesting thing to talk about, I thought I would mention it here because this is a really good example of a list that does not bias towards defense pieces, it does not bias towards insurance policies. Instead, it biases towards always having something to do in my active turn, almost no matter how many casualties I have sustained. Hope that was kind of interesting. Let's talk about JSA. So I am lucky enough to have one of the very few vanilla JSA players possibly anywhere in my local meta. He hasn't featured on the channel in a while because he's been on an awesome holiday, but he is back now. And that means we get the pleasure of seeing lists like this. And this is something that's really interesting because JSA, generic JSA, vanilla JSA, is a faction that is broadly and not unreasonably kind of assumed to be a bit vestigial, to not really need to exist. You, if you're playing JSA, much of the time what you will do is you will either play Shinden Butai or you will play Oban because there are not terribly many pieces that you would want from both. to make the decision to play the vanilla version of JSA worthwhile, and there are many very effective lists and AVA options, etc., that are available in each of those that make them very appealing. And much of the time, I think that's very much correct. And especially if you are a new player to JSA, I would pick a sectoral and start with it. Even if you picked both sectorals, I would start with sectorals before I moved to the vanilla faction. But Maddie is very much a vanilla JSA player. He's got experience with Oban, he's got experience with Shinden Butai, but he ultimately finds both just a tiny bit constraining. And this is something that I was talking to him about, and basically just talking through rationale. And there are a couple of different reasons why you might choose to play vanilla JSA. And one of them is that you actually really like Shinden Butai. And particularly, you really like Hatamoto. And let me tell you, Maddie really likes Hatamoto, and with very, very good reason. But you want to play more than one list, because there is one thing that Shinden Butai kind of has. It's very much one list syndrome. Now, definitely there'll be people in the comments who will say that's absolutely not true, and you're absolutely right. But it is a faction that it's very easy to build the Shinden Butai list and go, yep, this has got Hatamoto, this has got Tanuki, this has got Shizoku, two Kyojin killers, etc. You can just very easily fill out the bulk of a Shinden Butai list, and it's really good, but it is a tiny bit predictable, and it doesn't allow for long exploratory trips into the wilds of list construction. And that kind of thing is something that Matty really likes. And not every wargame rewards that, but Infinity really does. Because I guarantee you, right, there is going to be no player at our next satellite event that has played even close to as many games against JSA as Maddie will have played with JSA, and that means he's going to have an experiential advantage in every single game that he plays. And if he can find a list or two lists that work for him in the event, that work for him in the scenario mix, then whatever small power advantage he might be forsaking by not playing Oban, by not playing Shinden Butai, and frankly, I think it's a pretty small delta ultimately, that's more than made up for by the fact that he understands his list and he understands how his list plays, but his list will be presenting a novel problem to every opponent that he plays against. It certainly presented a novel problem to me this evening, although there will be some changes that we'll expect to see here. It's very unlikely this will be a final list. This is an experiment on the stepping path toward what will be an eventually a tournament list. So what have we got here? Well, in Combat Group 1, we're starting with a Ryukin. Very nice defensive piece. For all of my screed about dedicated ARO pieces, that does not mean they're bad, it just means they don't fit my playstyle. And the Ryukin threads the needle on what makes a good defensive piece very, very nicely. It's got Mimetism -6, Decoy, and Mine Lair, which means by itself it's 3 camouflage markers. Now, one of them is obviously a mine, but the other two, you have a decoy. On top of that, Ballistic Skill 12 with an X-Visor, that's fine, but Mimetism -6 and Surprise Attack gives it a surprisingly good active turn attack, and with a HRL it has Burst 2, which means it has the option to go active if it needs to. All of this for only 23 points and 1.5 SWC, which you have ably spare in this list. And you have a model that gives you a bunch of different defense capabilities, and some active turn capabilities, and the opportunity cost is not too high. Excellent piece, very happy to see it. We've then got, kind of in similar vein, 2 Ninja Killer Hackers. Now these are pieces that were always kind of basically solid, but received a very significant change that I very much appreciate in the most recent update. And that is the change to +1 special die on their tactical bows, which means in active turn, that's more of an option, but in reactive turn especially, you now kind of have to respect these as ARO pieces. Not respect them in the sense of, oh, my big active turn gun at 30 inches is concerned about drawing a bead on this Ninja KHD, but when you are moving through the midfield and these things are around, you don't want to take a double action round firing 2 shots at you for that chance to hit, basically on anything. You need to stop and deal with them. And given that they are specialists, they are good in close combat, they are climbing plus, they have mines, they are serviceable killer hackers, and they're only 26 points. 2 of these, fill your boots. Excellent choice. We then have a Kyojin killer, a fantastic trading element. It's basically a beast hunter that is actually good in melee. And being actually good in melee is a really big deal for a profile like that. Manny really likes these, and I absolutely don't blame him at all. I expect one of these in every single list that he plays. Kempai Chain of Command. The Kempai is present because we have a very active lieutenant in this list. Kempai is very sensible. Unlike, for example, with Saladin, where 9 games out of 10, maybe even 10 games out of 10, I don't actually expect to see Saladin either isolated or dead. The Hadamoto is going to be exposing itself to danger. It is a powerful active turn piece. Take the insurance for it. Aragoto Killer Hacker. This is a scenario where playing Hardlock, Aragoto is excellent, both either for its ability to go and get the beacons, or Hardlock is very much a button pressing scenario, more button pressing. One thing that my list does not have is 4 or 5 layers deep redundancy on specialists. That is something that Matty does have, and it's going to matter for him this game. Tokusetsu Kohai Engineer, in case you need to turn your Hadamoto back on. Senku Paramedic, it's a cheap paramedic, and there are multiple multi-wound heavy infantry, and then an Oni Waban. Combat Group 2, we have the Hadamoto Lieutenant +1 Order Spitfire, a Tanko Deactivator. These are going to be positioned. This is going to be positioned to take an Impetuous Order, lay down its Disco Ball, reload off of the Pangalung. Really high utility piece. Can occasionally get some kills as well. It's not actually a fantastic close combat model, but it's not terrible either. But its main purpose is to be annoying and make kind of a mess for very few points and provide that disco. Pangalung for reloads, Robio Ibot for an order, a war correspondent, and then Shinobu Kitsune. Now, for my money, Shinobu Kitsune is a bit too expensive, and frankly, after this game, Matty agrees. But it is in his nature to try every piece at least once, and so we were always going to see her from him at some juncture. It is terrifying, to be fair. We've got an Oniwaban and Shinobu in this list. That is an enormous amount of potentially very dangerous melee models with that powerful forward infiltration. But fundamentally, 44 points is just really, really expensive. There's an adage that I've run into, particularly over the course of N5, although I ran into it before that. There's an idea that drop troops never lose you a game, they only win you a game. And that's ultimately kind of misleading. It's not obviously true, it's not a truism, but it's a way of kind of communicating a point that, provided the opportunity cost for the piece is not too high, then a high variance piece with the potential for powerful high roll can be very good to include in a list, particularly in N5, where there are like 21, 19-point drop troops that can really overperform. Yeah, look, they might fail to stick the landing. There might be a situation where they can never parachutist on, they have to try and land, they fail. Okay, cool, they didn't do anything. If you are down 19 or 21 points for part of the game, and then it turns up and generates a regular order, the opportunity cost there is unlikely to cripple you. But Shinobu is 44 points, and if she doesn't do something, or if she doesn't do a lot of some things, there is a very high chance that she actually does scupper your efforts. She is just too expensive not to perform, and fundamentally she's a single wound model, and there is just always going to be a case where a single wound model takes a bad face-to-face roll, gets unlucky, cops a template, armor 1 doesn't hold up, and you are down almost a sixth of your list in one go. And for that reason, Shinobu is a bit of an acquired taste. I would definitely consider, in this case, cutting her for the Oniwaban, a second one of those. If you had the option, you don't, I want to say, in JSA. And so in that case, look, there are so many things that Shinobu could exchange for. I think I talked to Matty about this at the end of the game, and he said what she is actually displacing is a Shikami, and I fear a Shikami more. But not only that, a Shikami is more consistent. It's 2 wounds, it's shockingly mobile, it has high fizz eclipse smoke. Yes, it starts much further back than Shinobu, but I would trust a Shinobu in far more games. If you were considering approaching this list yourself, I would take a Shinobu, I'd take a Shikami instead. Overall though, fearsome list, and one that is making use of a bunch of the different options that JSA has in their vanilla profile to bring to bear. Now, rolling into the game, I roll a willpower 16 lieutenant, Matty rolls willpower 13, I win the roll, and I choose to deploy second on the left side of the table, which means my deployment zone will be basically behind this line here. Now, this is a little bit of a calculated risk because I know that Matty has been thinking about playing things like Oniwaban recently, and so I am actually a little bit scared of going second. But on the other hand, I don't have a sensor in my list. I don't have an ability to reveal those ninja. And so because they are hidden deployment, I am always going to get punched by them before I have some chance to deal with them, so I may as well go second in any case, and going second but picking deployment in this scenario is still pretty advantageous. Hardlock is very favored to second player because of how many points are locked behind controlling the central buttons, having those flipped in your favor, and that's something that's just going to be easiest for the second player to do. And on top of that, there were some specific things I was looking for in my deployment zone, and I found them on the left side of the table. So, Maddie is not willing to let my counterintelligence strategos list both deploy second and go first. He elects to go first, and his deployment is pretty solid. One of the things he does that is very sensible is that he does not hidden deploy his ninjas. This is something if you're playing actually just like JSA generally, if you have access to hidden deployment pieces, in N5 I find you want to be fairly judicious about your decision to hidden deploy. And the reason for that is that hidden deployment actually is not nearly as expensive as it used to be. It's easier to get hidden deployment models into a list, and you can as a result have lists like Maddie's one where there are technically 4 pieces with hidden deployment in this list. You don't want to hidden deploy all 4 of those because you're going to need some regular orders to prosecute your first turn. And so for that reason, the ninja camouflage markers are just deployed as Mim6 camouflage markers. I know that they're probably going to be ninja KHDs, but they will allow Maddie to get a few more regular orders on his first turn, and in fact his second turn as well, with fundamentally very little opportunity cost. Now, the Oniwaban and Shinobu will be hidden deploying because they are very powerful and Maddie wants to give me no opportunity to respond to them at all. But the ninjas, which will be deployed one here and one here, just deployed normally. In terms of other camouflage markers, the Ryukin and its mine are clustered in this position here. The blue holographic camouflage markers are the Mimetism 6, the green one is the mine, and pretty obviously the real Ryukin is the one on this high ground here, which I kind of know and Maddie knows that I know, but it's still a camouflage Mimetism 6 model with a HRL I'll have to deal with at some point. Behind these crates and this truck here, we have most of the heavy infantry. So the combat remotes, the paramedic, but more importantly, the Hatamoto and the Tanko are set up here, ready to move out in this direction, potentially push up the table, attack, etc. Some fairly good straight line movement and moderately good ground that can be covered by models moving up around past this helicopter, up the road and towards my deployment zone. The the Aragoto killer hacker deployed a little bit further along the left of Maddie's deployment zone, able to move out and around in this direction. It will move when it needs to. And then there are just sort of smatterings of support pieces, etc. The flash pulse remote. The war correspondent is standing on this bridge. The chain of command is hanging out in the furthest back point of the deployment zone over here. The engineer is deployed down behind this crate. I actually wasn't sure. The reserve drop is going to be Shinobu, unsurprisingly. The presence of this engineer actually made me wonder if there was a tag coming, and I kind of just deployed a little more conservatively than maybe I needed to as a result. But no, the reserve drop would be Shinobu. During Maddie's regular deployment, he makes a fizz roll to infiltrate and succeeds on a 9. As his reserve drop, he makes his roll to infiltrate and succeeds on a 16, declaring that as a critical, which means that we are seeing Shinobu, and of course I have no idea where she is. For my part, I am mostly going to be layering myself behind insulation of Ghazi Matawiya, but there are a few important things about the deployment. We've got Zamira down here, one Matawiya here, another Matawiya with a chain rifle behind this building right next to the beacon I'm defending. Zuleika here, ready to move around either side of the building as needed, although she will end up basically giving her life on the turn 1 attack. The Janissary and Odalisk team. Janissary is on the high ground behind this crate. It's watching a couple of different things. I'm actually using it as an ARO piece, right? It's still got burst 2, ballistic skill attack -3. It's watching down this direction where it can see anything that would vault up and over and move through this direction here. The Janissary is angled to have a line against. That is to say, the Hatamoto Imperial Guard would have to engage the Janissary outside of 24 inches to begin with, unless some orders are spent putting down disco, and even as it closes, we'd still be having gunfights where both of us are applying a negative modifier to each other. I have marginally higher ballistic skill, and I've got good armor, a higher damage gun. I can't necessarily stall out the Hatamoto along this line, but I can make its life a little bit more difficult. The Mukhtar is deployed a little bit aggressively in a forward position behind this nook between this crate and the building. I would actually rather have had it further back, but I'm cognizant that something is going to eventually need to put down this Ryukin, and for that reason I want the Mukhtar present to do so. It is a very valuable piece, and I'm reluctant to deploy in a position where theoretically an Oniwaban could be sitting, but we will resolve that problem at least in part with our reserve drop. The Hunsukut is as safe as I can make her. We're still being relatively forward positioned here. There is a staircase that she could go up to access the central button, or she could come out and around this direction to access the button on my left flank. I wanted to have that option because she's fairly important to my button pressing activities. And then finally, we've got my HVT and my treasure over here. And then the Zabek is deployed behind these two trees. The trees are being played as just solid terrain pieces. They join together. This is an impassable barrier. The Zabek is positioned in a very, very important manner, however. It is deployed so that there is no way around it, right? It's actually basically completely blocking off any path or line of sight that a model might try and move around it to get to a tiny infantry-based size hole that is behind it where Saladin goes as one of my reserve drops. And what that means is that the Zabek is blocking line of sight and blocking any melee attack on my most important piece, on my lieutenant. Because an aerial vehicle can't be engaged in close combat, it is basically totally fine. I have a near impervious defense against something like an Oniwaban or Shinobu Kitsune. And while I definitely have active turn plans for the Zabak, its presence there in that position means that I have basically one turn of relatively guaranteed safety with Saladin against the infiltrating ninjas. There are also like two Matawiya nooked down behind this tree here, so I'm in fairly good shape against anything that is coming down this direction. There is an Imarat and a Jammer there. Good luck getting through both of those without sustaining basically a stall of some description. Our other reserve drop is the Hassassin Fidei. Now, I had planned to put it in a position where maybe it might go after the beacon, or might come after things like the engineer over here, for example, but that was predicated on the idea that there could be a tag coming as Maddie's reserve drop. When Shinobu, obviously with the Fizz 16, I knew it was Shinobu from that reason. When Shinobu came down as the reserve drop infiltration role and I had no idea where she was, I wasn't willing to take the risk that this Mukhtar would get got on the first activation of the game. And so the Fidei is doing something kind of similar to the Zabak, where it is positioned just in front of the Mukhtar, blocking off any melee approach around it to get to the Mukhtar. Now, that does not mean the Mukhtar is invulnerable. It can be engaged with gunfire. There's the Fidei is not large enough to physically block that line of sight, but it is large enough to prevent a ninja from squeezing through. And so the goal is that it just buys me a turn with the Mukhtar to go and engage the Zimitism 6 pieces, and otherwise doesn't need to do anything. This is a game against JSA. The Fidei kind of struggles in any case. A lot of the pieces that I would want to send it against are just better than it in close combat, and so I'm kind of happy using it for this kind of tool. Now, as noted, Matty's got first turn, and he's presenting to me 6 regular orders, 1 irregular order in Group 1, and 4 regular orders, 1 irregular order, and 2 lieutenant orders in Group 2. And I'm not willing to accept the risk that there might, it looks a little bit like both of the infiltrating super ninjas might be in Group 1, but I'm not willing to guarantee that. And as it happens, it's not the case. And so I strip 1 order from each combat group. This leaves Matty with 5 regular orders, 1 irregular in Group 1, 3 regulars, 1 irregular, and 2 lieutenant in Group 2, and he spools up to come at me. And there are effectively 2 main lines of advance that he pursues this turn. The first is a kind of classified-oriented line of advance with the Hatamoto and the Tenko. The goal of this is not actually to push all the way into my deployment zone, it's to secure the classified, which he's got to assassinate the HVT, and stage the Hatamoto for a future attack. So the way that he does that is that the Tenko impetuous around and attempts to throw a disco. Now, whiffs it, but spends a regular order to pull back behind near the baggage and lay down the disco with the second order, reloads at that point. And having gotten the disco down basically in this position here, he uses the Hatamoto's orders to come up and around and make some willpower rolls against the HVT to attempt to remove it. Now, he does not get into base contact, he actually fails 2 of these and then pulls the Hatamoto back. Not going to materially impact the game, but it is one of 2 pieces of bad luck this turn that is going to have a bit of an impact on the remainder of how Matty wants to play the game out. 1 point will not swing things, but it would have been good to have gotten, because as first player in this scenario, you need every single point that you can get. The other line of advance is pretty classically what I would expect Matty to do in this situation with the kind of factions that he plays. It is Kojin Killer time. And that's not me saying, oh, Matty is predictable. The Kojin Killer is in the list to be a turn 1 attack piece. It is irregular, it is eminently disposable, and it is dangerous. And so it comes out and around this way, uses its super jump. It's not super fast, but it is moving 6 inches on the jump, 4 inches on the secondary move. It sort of swings past the Hunzakut just to see if it wants to reveal. It doesn't. Comes down around through this building, and then finally around and into close combat with the Ghazi Matawiya. Now it cops a bunch of AROs at that point. It has to be standing for the movement, so Zuleika is able to flamethrower it. There are some random gunshots from the Matawiya and Zamira over here, but the main thing that happens is that it dies to the chain rifle, and then the second pretty significant piece of bad luck for Maddie materializes. He scores 2 hits, no crits, which is 4 saves at damage 6, and the Matawiya rolls a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 6 on its defense roll, which means that it's fine. Which means Maddie has spent a lot of orders and a 15-point trooper to accomplish nothing, which really sucks. And with the death of the Kyojin, he kind of makes the decision that no, he has to clear the jammer off of this beacon. Any long-term play in this scenario, if you're going first, kind of relies on you stealing the beacon at some point, or otherwise just doing so much damage to your opponent that you can stroll onto the buttons and they can't possibly test it on the final round. Even that, frankly, is very difficult to truly guarantee. Like, the retreat rules alone mean that I would not be totally comfortable hoping to just coast to victory on 2 buttons pressed. I have had situations in this scenario going first where I thought I was in a good position and I wasn't because the buttons are so important. And so Maddie makes the decision that no, he has to unlock this beacon. He has to be able to get past it, has to be able to kill the jammer, and so an Oni-Waban appears. And it uses the few remaining orders in Group 1 to sneak past the Matawiya. The Matawiya holds other things discover, but the important thing is that the Oni-Waban gets around and then goes prone, and then it crawls into close combat with the Matawiya and puts it down to dead. Like, totally unsurprisingly, it's an Oni-Waban. EMCCW absolutely eviscerates the Matawiya, but enough orders have been spent on other things that that's it. The Oni-Waban has to end its activation in the open and not camouflaged, right? He had to convert the irregular order. No, the irregular order was the Kojin. So he had no orders left basically to spend on the Oni-Waban after it killed the Matawiya, which is a pretty grim play to have to make, but I get the reckoning that he kind of had to do it. So that passes play into my first turn, and I'm basically of the opinion that I'm in a pretty good position here. And that appraisal is pretty accurate. Now, there is too much Mimetism 6, there are too many dangerous things, right? Maddie's list has many of the same principles of redundancy as my own, which means that there is no way I'm delivering a knockout punch on the first turn, but we can slowly build an attritional advantage. Even just going into my first turn, I have 14 of my pieces active. I am down exactly 6 points from a Jammer Matawiya. Maddie is down 15 points from a Kyojin killer. Cool. I'm already in a good spot. This is a turn 3 scenario. This is a situation where I want to just be in a situation where I can press multiple buttons on the final turn and win the game that way. And so for now, we're going to play for attrition. And it's going to be a pretty solid turn. We're going to begin with an impetuous order, or with some impetuous orders. Matawiya on this flank will move up and around. They're safe to do so. I am concerned about the Ryukin, but we have a plan for dealing with that a little bit later. And then Zuleika comes up these, we're playing these stairs as a ramp, so Motorcycle's going to access them. Zuleika comes up and around and into close combat with the Oni-Waban. Now, the Oni-Waban declares CC attack, she declares flamethrower. This is a trade, but I'm very happy trading my cheap biker for Maddie's very expensive super ninja, and so both of them go down, and importantly, they go down in the impetuous phase, which means I still have her order. Now, strictly speaking, at this stage, Maddie and I have each traded 2 troops for 2 troops, but I have a lot more points left on the field and an entire turn to play out, looking to just get kills. And so the bulk of the remainder of this turn is going to be an attack up this roadway. At the beginning of the turn, we moved the Matawiya with the Emarat and boarding shotgun down here into Group 2, because I don't anticipate needing the Janissary too much at this stage. But we will begin with the Janissary just to see if we can bait the Ryukin out. So the Janissary comes out and around this crate to see the war correspondent, but it does so in a way that lets Matty take an arrow with the Ryukin, because I want to see if he's willing to do so. If he's not, I'll have put myself in a position where I can see the Ryukin, potentially declare a discover shoot, but Matty is kind of aware that he's in a position where he's at least points behind, and the prospect of rolling 2 arrows against my 1 active turn piece is worthwhile to him, so he drops the Ryukin out of camouflage. I put 1 dice into the War Correspondent and 3 dice plus 1 special die into the Ryukin. The War Correspondent actually survives, but that many dice with Ballistic Skill Attack -3 into the Ryukin is sufficient to put it down, whereas the Janissary survives, so that clears 1 piece off. Now, had the Ryuken declined to reveal, we were going to bring the Matawiya up and around, also bring around the Mukhtar, etc., but I was happy to take care of it at this particular point. We then have a line of advance up this road here. And there are three pieces that will be launching an attack. The first is the Matawiya. It runs up in this direction, actually baits the ninja. I say baits. The ninja reveals to shoot it, and I am lucky to survive. I think I throw smoke in face to face, and it's basically just a situation where everyone kind of whiffs. But with everyone having whiffed, the Mukhtar comes out and around, and the Mukhtar is very good at putting down ninjas. And so 4 dice on 13s into the ninja puts it in the dirt, and then the Matawiya, using the remainder of the group 2 orders, continues its attack and goes after the Hatamoto. Now, the presence of an Imarat and a boarding shotgun gives me a very good fork here. I say very good. The Hatamoto is very hard to put down even with a boarding shotgun. I get 2 or 3 orders with the Matawiya against the Hatamoto, and over the course of those 3 orders, I deal 1 wound to it. And look, frankly, that's totally reasonable. The Hatamoto is dodging on 13s to avoid the Imarat, but then I'm shooting it twice on 11s. That's a face-to-face roll, takes a very long time to resolve, and so 1 wound is totally fine. Those were orders from the second combat group. Now, the third piece that will get active this turn moving up my left flank is the Zabak, and it comes out and around and it wreaks a merry hell, because unlike basically every other model in my list, it can engage things like the Hatamoto closely with no fear. If you are within 4 inches of the Hatamoto under any other circumstance and it makes a dodge roll, you always have to be at least a little bit scared, because it dodges 4 inches, and if it gets into close combat, that's it. Like, I was willing to move a Matawiya towards it, because if the Matawiya got into CC, I would just fire into that close combat until the Matawiya was dead, and then continue shooting the Hatamoto. A sacrifice for the name of Haqqislam. But the Zabak has no such risks. It can't be engaged in CC. And so we do a coordinated order, there's a bunch of movement, we're going to lay down some smoke. We'll be using coordinated orders during this turn to move these pieces here across this gap, because there are still ARO models I don't really want to deal with. We'll be using coordinated orders to move them across this gap and to re-establish the defensive position that was broken open by the Onowaban. But while those coordinated orders are happening, we'll move forward the Zabak. And what will then happen is that the Zabak will just go on an attack against the Hatamoto. It'll take a few orders off to strafe down the biker. That's a piece that I really wanted to put down because it represented a specialist. Killing specialists in this scenario is very valuable, but also the biker could have launched an attack to try and clear off my defenses around the button again. But basically, the Zabak is able to fly up and over this helicopter and just put shots into, eventually it gets over the back of and gets behind. It basically launches this strafing attack over the top of the Hatamoto, and then it's behind the Hatamoto, and it's shooting the Hatamoto in the back. And even though it doesn't have mimetism, it's still ballistic skill attack -3, it's firing armor-piercing rounds. And while it takes a really long time, and it even takes some return fire, it's armor 5, it's totally fine. The Hatamoto is only armed with a Spitfire and a heavy pistol. These are good weapons, but they will struggle to put damage on an armor 5 flyer. After a bunch of orders, but orders that I had spare, we put the Hatamoto down. As mentioned, and now we're looking at the beginning of Matty's second turn, we did a bunch of coordinated orders to re-establish the defensive position on the beacon. That'll be meaning moving the Matawiya into this position here behind this little crate, moving Zamira over to take the position of Zuleika, and then pulling the Haytham all the way back. Matty is in a rough position here because I still am only down the 2 troopers. And while he isn't in loss of lieutenant because of his chain of command, he is increasingly short on pieces that can be used to win the game. But he will make a very game attack. And this is one of those situations where we will see the Tanko kind of just show its quality. As a reminder, it's a very cheap piece, but it is not to be underestimated. It moves around with its impetuous activation. Matty is very good, by the way, at making use of impetuous activations with Tankos. He's happy having them unlinked if need be. It actually uses its deactivator to turn the disco ball back on, and then it proceeds to move up. It has to take a cautious move. I do have a line with the Zabak, but he's able to use stealth to get up just behind the helicopter and then 6 inches cautious around into the eclipse smoke, at which point he moves into close combat with the Matawiya, uses his shock CCW to comfortably put it down, then move through the smoke, and then in the next order after that, move around into close combat with, and monofilleting the Mukhtar to death. Now, losing the Mukhtar is a little bit of a shame, but most of the pieces I would have needed to kill are dead, and I do land a jammer with the Ghazi that is hanging out behind this tree, and I isolate the Tanko there. Now, there probably would not have been enough orders for the Tanko to continue on around into Saladin. And on the terminal approach to the Mukhtar, he was actually taking ARO pieces. Now he spanged. There's a Janissary that's moved into this position on this behind this crate here on the high ground. Janissary was actually shooting at it with the heavy machine gun. Tankos only have limited cover, not no cover. From the position that it was in, it was actually fine there. I say fine. It was able to resist heavy machine gun fire. But even if that jammer had failed the first time, it was pretty likely that I would stop the Tanko from getting around and into Saladin, but that was still a risk I was glad to have stall out there, because really don't want Saladin to die. I've still got some command tokens in the bank, but that is something that would have made the remainder of the game much more complicated. And again, I am willing to expend all of the various pieces I have between Saladin and death to make sure that Saladin does not suffer death. Now, the remainder of the turn Matty has access to here is going to be spent on Shinobu. She'll have flipped into Combat Group 1 at the beginning of the turn, but she will not have that many orders to spend, and what she'll be trying to do is to suppress as best she can with her combi rifle the defensive elements that I have around the beacon. She's actually going to be behind this crate here. She'll move out and around to see Zamira. She'll put her unconscious but not dead, but that's going to end up being the bulk of what she's able to accomplish. She's not quite able to get easy shots on the Matalia, she's not able to hurt the Zabak, and so she ends up moving just far enough around to not quite be in the Zabak's line of fire, and then go into suppressive. That's the bulk of what Maddie can do with this turn, and while that is a very good attack with the Tanko, I am still heading into my turn 2, comfortably up on attrition. So the plan for turn 2 is most the same as the plan for turn 1, but we're going to throw in a little bit of scenario play here. First, however, we do have to deal with this Tanko. Yes, it is isolated. That does not mean that Saladin is in zero danger, and so we're going to be moving the Janissary around first to get a shot at the Tanko completely out of cover. We are inside 16, but that actually serves me just fine, since the Tanko is armed with a light shotgun and a Blitzen. It's no better for him than it is for me, and the Janissary spools up the heavy machine gun, 5 dice, Blister skill attack -3, and puts the Tanko down. The Janissary then continues his tour around to get to this position here, where it's able to engage Shinobu Kitsune from very long range. Importantly, less than 32, more than 24. That forces her out of suppressive fire. She throws smoke instead. Blister skill attack -3 works against that, and we put her down. No, sorry, I tell a lie. That's not going to happen this turn. She actually does survive that shot. She passes the save and then guts around, but she's out of suppressive fire, and I have a means past her. I use the remainder of the orders in Combat Group 2 to continue activating the Odalisk and Janissary Fire Team, with the Odalisks being the important part here because I have the Paramedic, and the Paramedic is able to move up and around. Paramedic is further back, she's able to move up and around, fire Paramedic darts into Zamira and resuscitate her, which is fantastic. Now, the fact that this Shinobu has survived is going to cause some complications on my final round, but it's not the end of the world, and we have relatively fewer orders now because we have sustained a bunch of casualties in the first combat group, but we'll do a little bit of movement, a little bit of coordination. We'll get the Zabak into a further back position. It's a bit too far forward right now, and the Hunzukut will go and do Hunzukut things. It will move around in this direction, and after I think 1 or 2 failures, we'll press this button, jump up, vaulting onto these barrels and then onto the high ground, move around and press this button as well. Now, it's possibly too early in the game for this, in retrospect. I think if I'd been thinking slightly longer term, I would have recognized that Maddie still had this Ninja KHD here, and on his last turn, he was kind of going to be forced to attempt to press both of those buttons. So the more sensible thing would be to have pressed just this button here, and then maybe say lay a mine on the high ground or try and cover this position somehow, but then pull back to safety. I didn't do that. I think I overextended pushing the Hunzukut forward. And indeed, as we pass into Matty's turn 3, we're basically going to see what happens. Now, there was one line of play where I attempted to use the remaining orders in my first and second, mostly first combat group, to put down this ninja. I had this, you'll remember that there was a Jammer Matawi here. It moved forward and around this way as part of coordinated orders, and then intuitive attacked the ninja. That revealed the ninja, but I was not able to isolate it. That was fine. The goal was to shoot it, because if you intuitive attack with a jammer, even provided you succeed the roll, you'll still cause a BTS roll, which will reveal a model under camouflage. However, in this case, it just usually what will happen is we'll tempt the reset. It's just that things were inconclusive, and then, kinda unsurprisingly, I couldn't put the ninja down. They are Mimetism -6, they are hard to kill. I have just been flying around with a Zabek doing most of this shooting this time, and so unsurprisingly, it survived. This puts the ninja in a position in Maddie's turn 3 here, basically where Maddie does still have a line to win the game. It is just a dice-related line. The first thing that needs to happen is the ninja needs to press this button, which it succeeds. I think we'll have Shinobu basically come out and neutralize the Matawiya first. I think she actually neutralizes it basically by yeeting around trying to fight everything, but that does bait the jammer out, which means the Ghazi has no more jammers. With no more jammers on the Ghazi, the ninja is able to press this button, move out in this direction, actually use climbing plus to come around the ladder here because there's an ARO it wants to avoid taking. It's going to run around toward the Hunzakut. The Hunzakut will place a mine. The ninja will move into combat with the Hunzakut and stab it. No, sorry. The ninja will press the button successfully, spang the mine. The Hunzakut will place another mine. The ninja will move into combat with the Hunzakut and kill the Hunzakut, but then die to the second mine. So the Hunzakut and the ninja trade out, but as we pass into my final round, we can actually see that, strictly speaking, Matty is not in a losing position yet. I mean, things are grim. Things are very, very grim, but he has 2 midfield buttons pressed. Shinobu is actually still alive at this stage. I will have to put her down. And if everything else goes terribly, there is still a line where my dice could crap out badly enough to lose the game. Now, that is very unlikely, right? I'm not going to gaslight you into saying, oh, I could lose this somehow. But he's taken the best line that he can. And if you play 100 tournament games, in one of them, playing your outs is going to matter. And so I basically respect the line that he took there, even if from an attrition perspective he was in rough shape, and he'd basically been in rough shape since turn 1. How my turn plays out, therefore, is mostly an exercise in how many points can I actually score. And so, in that purpose, Saladin moves himself into Combat Group 2. We've then got basically a couple of lines that we pursue. The first is that we kill Shinobu. I think Janissary puts her down. And then the Janissary and the Odalisque team move up and forward, up and around here, with the goal of getting the Odalisque paramedic to press this button. Now, the reason why I moved Saladin is basically to make sure that I had, I think, 4 shots at this, because it was absolutely critical. Like, that was the game-winning play, right? The game was won as soon as the Odalisque pressed that button, but if I failed it once or twice and I didn't have enough orders, I would put myself up shit creek. And so I just put Saladin into Combat Group 2 to make sure that I had 3 or 4 orders to press that button. And sure enough, after 2 button presses, the Odalisque flips this button to my side, which means that I have 2 buttons pressed, which means the game is won. We can, however, do a little bit better, and this is where a bunch of coordinated orders will come into play. Using all of our remaining command tokens, we're going to be launching a very large attack up and around in this direction. We'll be coordinating the Matawiya, the Zabak, Zamira, now that she is back, and the Hassassin Fidei. The Fidei's mission is quite simple. It moves out and around in this direction where it can secure the HVT. Cool, its job is done. I think it actually gets hit by a shotgun at some point on the way through because the chain of command model has moved up and the Fidei goes down. But we have enough orders left in Combat Group 2 to move the Odalisque around to do the same thing. And then the Zabak, Zamira, and the Ghazi Matawiya basically just run in this direction. And they have enough orders to push aggressively through. The boarding shotgun chain of command model is not able to hold forever. The Zabak actually just comes like all the way up and over, strafes down the Kempetai on the way through, takes a wound from the mine, but that doesn't matter because that has done enough. It has killed all of the remaining pieces on ARO, and now Zamiro can move out and around and press the button, or touch the button. Touching the button controls it. That gives me access to the beacon, in addition to all of the other points score, and that puts the game very persuasively. I think Maddie has scored 1 point, would have been 2 if he didn't classify it on the first turn. And I am looking at whatever is enough. I think I've got enough for a major victory, which frankly in Hardlock I'll take every day of the week because it is difficult to accomplish that, particularly getting more than just sort of like the bare minimum points you need from the central objectives. So that concludes the game. Definitely ultimately one-sided in Hassassin's favor, but very enjoyable. Very good to get the reps in with what is increasingly one of my favorite factions in N5. And I think this is one of my first games, almost certainly not my first game, but certainly my first game against JSA post-October patch. And so really cool to see some of what they can do. Absolutely respect particularly the ninjas in this situation. seeing them in play wants to make me go back and look at some of the non-aligned armies that have access to ninjas, because ninja KHDs were always totally fine, but with all of the little incremental changes that they've had, access to Climbing Plus in N5, access to the +1 special die on their bows since October 2025, basically just a bunch of little changes have them in a state now where I would be very happy to put basically them in any single list, and they're present in force in this one. The Oni Waban and Shinobu, I think we're of the conclusion at this stage where Shinobu should be cut and exchanged with a Shikami, and I think the presence of a Shikami would have made this entire game considerably more fraught for me. Yes, Shinobu did plenty of stuff. Yes, she was moderately valuable, but the the Shikami is ultimately more mobile and a specialist and much more durable. And on basically any of the turns after the first, could have taken a higher value line of play than Shinobu did. Yep, she did a bunch of gunfighting with her combi rifle. Okay, cool. But the Shikami would always be capable of making crack the game open plays. So yeah, definitely would change her. But I respect Maddie making the decision to at least test Shinobu, because if you don't test something, you'll never be completely sure. So that concludes our game for this week. A little bit of theory, a little bit of list dojo. Hope overall you've enjoyed it. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. We do videos about once a week covering Infinity and other topics, wargaming generally, other wargames like Conquest, and so if you'd like to see or support those videos, you can do so via the means just described. It's channel members and supporters that let me continue making these videos, make them so fun as I do, and so thank you very much everyone who supports the channel, and for everyone, I'll see you next week with more wargaming content.